Good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Business Webinar Series 2021. This year, we have decided to look at economic recovery and economic growth after and still during the devastation wreaked upon us by COVID-19. We thought it's important to look at how do we turn our economy around, and we thought that one of the best people and the best brains in our country and in Africa to talk about what needs to be done is Mr. Martin Kingston. Martin Kingston, let me just tell you a few things about him. He is the executive chairperson of Rothschild and Company South Africa Pty. He's also a board member and vice president of Business Unity South Africa. He's also the chair of the steering committee of Business South Africa COVID-19. He has 4 decades of global experience in investment banking and capital markets with a particular focus on corporate finance in the private and public sector. My name is Randall Jonas, and I would just briefly like to tell you what Martin is really going to do today. He is going to tell us what he thinks we should be doing in collaboration with government and business and other stakeholders to bring about economic turnaround in our country, given the challenges we had as a result of a faltering South African economy pre-COVID, and now with the devastation of COVID-19, of course, further challenges that we have experienced. And I'm sure that you will find this a very, very interesting discussion this morning. We are also inviting you to please gather your pens and your pads and write down some questions you'd like to have to pose to Martin. You can do so in the chat box. And if necessary, I will allow you to do the question directly to Martin during the course of this webinar. So without much further ado, I'm going to hand you over now to Mr. Martin Kingston to do a chat to us on unlocking South Africa's potential. Martin, over to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Dr. Jonas. I hope everybody can hear me, and good morning to everybody who's participating in this webinar. I hope that people will find it useful and even interesting. I'm going to, if I may, try and share my screen. Everybody knows I'm not very good at this stuff. So I hope that's up. Is that up? Can somebody confirm?
It's visible to all. Thank you so much.
Perfect. All right. Thank you so much indeed, Randall. Okay, let me start. It'll take about 25 minutes to go through this presentation. And then for the balance of the time, I'm obviously available to take questions and comments. All right, so this is a presentation that we are making at the moment based upon the work that's been done over the past 12 months, particularly in the light of the pandemic that we've had to all endure and that we're going to have to endure for certainly the balance of this year and next year. Let's trust that we can get the vaccine rolled out as quickly as possible. And in the meanwhile, if I can encourage everybody to stay safe, to stay at home, and to encourage those who are able to get the vaccine to register and be vaccinated. All right, so it's most important, I think, first of all, to set the context in the broader global environment. Obviously, COVID has been an extraordinary once in a lifetime event, not only for us, but globally. And the lockdowns that have followed it have impacted very severely on global economy and levels of volatility. Having said that, after a very significant contraction globally in 2019 and 2020 in particular, we're seeing a rebound in 2021, globally 6% and 4.5% in 2022, with emerging markets and developing economies leading that. I'm afraid South Africa is not at the head of the queue. It's somewhat in the back of the queue, and we need to, and we'll talk about what we need to do as a country to address our challenges and achieve our objectives and potential. We're seeing global policy stimulus taking place. It's going to continue, we think, into 2022 with associated high levels of budget deficit, increasing levels of debt, and the need to be able to fund a vaccination program, very difficult, of course, for emerging markets. And we've highlighted here the primary risks to global growth, which is the levels of debt, volatility, particularly in commodities such as oil, macro economic issues, as well as global political issues. We've highlighted here US-China tensions. And in the context of South Africa, if we're going to be able to deliver our potential, then we need to compete aggressively for investment in the face of domestic challenges, as well as an international environment where everybody else is competing for scarce capital. And we need to focus on how we address lack of state capacity and the slow delivery of structural reform. This slide talks about the journey that we've walked since 1994, the key metrics. And as you can see, red is unfortunately bad, green is good. That if we look at the key metrics of debt to GDP, GDP growth, our rating as a country, levels of confidence and competitiveness, unemployment, and the Gini coefficient, we have unfortunately undone much of the progress that had been made in the early years. It hadn't helped during the paralysis, if you like, and I have to say, perhaps the backward steps that we took during the Zuma administration, but whatever progress we'd made has been unwound. We now have debt to GDP levels at record highs. We have a lower sovereign credit rating in terms of the cost of borrowing, lower than it was in 1994, unemployment at record levels. And all of that has been obviously exacerbated by COVID, which has highlighted and magnified inequality, unemployment, and poverty. And therefore, our position has been as business that we need to implement structural reforms, and we need to do so in a meaningful and tangible manner if we're going to increase levels of confidence. If I take us around this chart, you can see, and I'll go from the top left, the widening budget deficit, unfortunately, as a consequence of lowering levels of GDP growth. We measure South Africa here against the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, and the MINT countries, Mexico, Indonesia, Nigeria, and Turkey. You can see in all cases, we dropped further in terms of contraction in GDP, and our rebound is less pronounced than theirs has been. You can equally see in terms of debt to GDP, the increasing levels of debt to GDP, highly problematic, as we've had to consistently review where our debt is going to be and increase it. Lowering levels of ease of doing business. You can see how we've slipped through the ranking. These are the World Bank rankings, and also low levels of business confidence, or we've seen some pickup in the last 6 months in terms of business confidence. By the same token, as I've said, if unemployment is our most significant challenge, it's not our only one, but certainly potentially our most significant one, we're now at a 15-year high. Narrow unemployment at 32.6%, but of course broad at 42.6%, an absolutely untenable state of affairs. If you look at the level of employment in the public versus the private sector, you can see that the public sector still has very significant level of workers that are employed in the public sector. We think that that needs to be constrained. Average household income and household debt has somewhat recovered, but nevertheless is at almost all-time highs. And the inequality index, the Gini coefficient, you can see we are one of the most unequal societies in the world. And indeed, we haven't addressed that since 1994. It's actually deteriorated. And then in the most recent budget speech delivered in February by the Minister of Finance, he's had to deliver a very complicated message as he balances between ever increasing levels of expenditure and low levels of revenue. So you can see the budget deficit there at 9% of GDP. And if you look at the pie chart in the top right-hand corner, very significant proportion going to compensation of employees, those that are employed by the state, a very significant proportion, 13.8% going to interest payments. And of course, that interest cost is going up because if you look at the bottom of the chart, you can see how we have drifted down through the ratings in terms of our credit rating. Now we're sub-investment grade or junk status. There are many levels of junk status, unfortunately, so we can't assume that we've gone as far as we can go. We can go further. And these are the three key aspects that could actually further precipitate additional downgrades, which is that we have ever increasing levels of debt to GDP, that we don't implement structural reforms. I'll talk about that. And therefore that reduces our access to funding and increases our cost of funding. Despite all of this, I believe we all know that we are very well positioned, at least theoretically, to attract investment. There are a number of positive features. We have a very successful and attractive capital market, one of the best in the world, in my opinion. Equally so, the banking sector, highly regulated, but very well capitalized. When I say highly, I mean well regulated, well managed and overseen. We have got a disproportionate amount of international investment, the largest presence of multinationals on the continent, a robust legal and regulatory framework. Let's see how it's tested today when we see the delivery of the decision by the Constitutional Court with respect to former President Zuma. A very vibrant private sector, although I have to say there's more that can be done, particularly around small and medium-sized enterprises, a burgeoning middle class, a well-established independent judiciary and media, and of course, theoretically, we can take advantage of being a hub to exploit opportunities in the rest of the continent. Last year, in the context of the pandemic, we established Business for South Africa. So Business for South Africa was a virtual platform. It was assembled in such a manner that it could actually bring together all business interests as a matter of urgency to be able to formulate a response to the pandemic, one of which was on the economic front. And in July, as you can see, we tabled to the president and to the cabinet our accelerated economic recovery strategy. It had identified a limited number of interventions that could drive economic growth and reinforce levels of confidence. So when I say limited, 10 key projects, 12 policy focus areas, and 15 immediate actions or low-hanging fruit. Unfortunately, as in many things in South Africa, it got caught up in process. It was then incorporated into a NEDLAC economic recovery action plan. I lead the business engagement with Casco Vadia, the chief executive of Business Unity South Africa at NEDLAC, with our social partners, where we consulted our social partners of civil society, labor, and of course, government as well. And then we immediately thereafter formulated that into a program that was finalized in September 2020, again presented to government, who then announced in October their Economic Reconstruction and Recovery Plan, the ERRP, which is drawn very significantly from the Economic Recovery Action Plan of NEDLAC. And we've, in that context, also incorporated the Job Summit commitments that have been put in place 2 years previously, so that we have a single-minded focus on all of the issues that we need to work together to address South Africa's challenges and achieve its potential. This is a busy slide, and I apologize for that, but we had identified collectively, this is the Economic Recovery and Reconstruction Plan. We had identified 9 priority interventions. You can see them listed here. I'm going to focus in this presentation on infrastructure, employment-orientated strategic localization, reindustrialization, and export promotion, as well as energy security. But you can see the others: tourism, gender equality, the green economy, mass public employment interventions, through to macroeconomic interventions. Then key enablers around resource mobilization and fighting corruption. Again, I'll address that today. Regulatory changes that are consistent and implementable. Building a capable state, I'll also talk about today. Social compacting, exactly what we have been doing. at NEDLAC, skills development and economic diplomacy, particularly into Africa. And then finally, structural reforms. So 9 structural reforms, including the network industries and SOEs, so the likes of Telkom, Eskom, the rail network, the water industry, reorientating trade policies, particularly with a view on regional integration, lowering barriers to entry, which again, I will talk about. Then how we can address labor-intensive sectors, greater levels of economic inclusion, dealing with those sectors of the economy that are not creating the necessary and sustainable jobs. Obviously and critically important, boosting education and skills development, and then promoting beneficiation and addressing racial, gender, and geographical inequalities. So all of these work streams are now being overseen in the context of the ERRP, but for today, I'm just going to focus on a limited number of those. On infrastructure, investment, and delivery, it's worthwhile pointing out that we are way below where we should be if the National Development Plan target had been implemented. So you can see here that was 30%. We're at less than 25%, and we've been pulling down. But most importantly, you'll see here that the principal driver for infrastructure investment and delivery here is, in fact, the private sector. We think that if we look at key watch points, and each of these slides is addressed around the context of key interventions and key watch points. So in terms of key watch points, what we should be looking out for, how we can address regulatory hurdles that preclude or prevent or complicate the implementation of infrastructure, that we gazette the National Infrastructure Plan after its presentation to Cabinet this month, that the Water Master Plan is indeed endorsed by Cabinet, that we deal with spectrum auction and licensing of WOAN, address corrupt procurement activities, look at establishing TNPA as an independent subsidiary. You'll have seen the President's announcement in that particular regard, and boost business confidence so that we can increase the level of private sector participation. And the interventions, obviously, that are necessary are public-private partnerships to look at investing in, delivering, and indeed operating infrastructure, as well as developing local supplier industries for that infrastructure. That goes hand in glove, of course, with the need for beneficiation and localization, which I will talk about. The second, which we will be all very familiar with, is the need for energy security and affordability. We know that we've seen decreasing availability of energy, so the energy availability factor from Eskom, you can see it dropping down from 2010 to where we are now in 2021, and indeed forecast to reduce further to below 65% before we start recovering. The focus in 2019 primarily on coal and the migration away from coal, particularly, but not only to photovoltaic. And again, if we look at our key watch points, we need to see what level of unscheduled maintenance, load shedding there is, because it obviously is a significant handbrake on growth. The new regulations that are going to be gazetted about the recently announced increase of the cap on embedded generation to 100 megawatts. We pressed very hard in our engagements directly and indirectly with government to achieve that. We think it's a very significant move. The ability for municipalities to formulate their own power mix, the need for the integrated resource plan to allow for a significant increase in the contribution of renewable energy from all sources. We think about 11.8 gigawatts. And when we look at the key interventions, a clear and critical focus on the need for the stabilization, separation, and unbundling of Eskom, fast-tracking self-generation, as I've already talked, the construction of liquid natural gas terminals at Coega, as well as repurposing power stations in Mpumalanga, and the diversification of energy sources and the migration away from carbon intensive power production. And only when we've got secure, competitive and reliable and predictable, I have to say, power, will we be able to unleash the real opportunities for many sectors of the economy in South Africa. The third area that I said I would focus on is localization. What became apparent in the context of the pandemic last year, particularly when we went into hard lockdown on the 26th of March, level 5, was the extent to which we were dependent upon imported goods and materials, and the need to see whether we can diversify our own manufacturing base in South Africa and localize much more effectively. And we as Business Unity South Africa have identified a number of champions, CEOs of businesses that can drive some 42 different areas of product activity to see to what extent we can localize. If you look at the chart, you can see that in terms of manufacturing as a percentage of GDP, we have a much lower percentage than the global average, and it's fallen from 19.2% in 1994 to 11.8% now. And equally, if you look at imports, a much higher level of imports than we would want, 25.1% compared to the global average of 21.8%. Much of this is dependent, of course, upon structural reform, the ability to implement those structural reforms which will boost levels of confidence and ensure that we have an environment which is appropriate for investment, both domestic and mobilizing investment from abroad. The need to ensure, and we're working very closely with the Department of Trade, Industry and Competition, that we focus on those sectors of the economy where we can be competitive and at scale, and that there's sound, as we've said here, data-driven technical analysis. And in terms of the interventions that are required, so obviously that to the extent possible, local manufacturers procure themselves locally, but also that major consumers only procure from local supply chain to the extent that's possible, driven by such things as buy local campaigns, that we act effectively and decisively on illegal imports. We introduce transversal contracts in government, and we strengthen a master planning process across both within and across sectors without breaching competition or antitrust regulations, so that we can maximize the potential for localization and local procurement. Unfortunately, in South Africa, we have a very underperforming SMME sector, underperforming relative to its potential. In most economies, SMMEs are the largest driver of GDP. And unfortunately, in South Africa, business entry costs and the regulatory environment, or red tape, has significantly constrained the ability for there to be the level of activity that we would expect and profitability by small and medium-sized enterprises. And you can see here, it's a very unhelpful chart because it sends a bad message. Unfortunately, there's 191 countries that have been ranked here. This is the ease of doing business. So from starting a business, you can see through to resolving insolvency on the right-hand side. If you look in 2008, we were 53rd out of 191 in terms of starting a business. Now we're 139th. In almost every single one of these metrics, with the exception of paying taxes, you'll see that our position has deteriorated. As we've said here, overall ease of doing business from 32nd in 2008 to 84th in 2020. And it's the small and medium-sized enterprises that are, I'm afraid, at the receiving end of this. And unfortunately, the attendant employment that would flow does not flow. So there are three key watch points. The Presidential Labour Market Commission, which is looking at the labour market framework and the extent to which it's hampering development of small businesses, partnerships with the private sector, particularly but not only in the context of startups. And that, of course, moves into the concept of establishing incubation and digital hubs in the next 3 years, particularly around townships and rural areas. And those interventions, inter alia, will contribute to driving public employment programs. We need to completely revamp SETA skills training, specifically, but not only, in the context of both digitalization and retraining those workers that have been retrenched. We need to support efforts to invest in green jobs, fast track critical skills, including when necessary, importing people and ensuring that there's a visa regime that allows us to bring people with skills that don't reside in South Africa into the country, at least for long enough to be able to transfer those skills and capabilities. And as we've said, the skills strategy needs to be much more demand-led and responsive to the changing nature of work and the workplace. And then finally, I think the fifth item that I wanted to identify in this particular set of slides was building a capable state. The president has been very clear, and consistently so, that one of the biggest challenges that he's found has been an incapable state, both at the level of national government, provincial, and most importantly, perhaps, at local government, although this slide is focusing particularly on state-owned enterprises, where we have consistently argued the need for them to be well governed, operationally sound, appropriately capitalized, and therefore financially sustainable, with realistic, viable, and fit for purpose strategies in their sectors concerned. And if you look at the chart, you can see the very significant onus on the country's shoulders in terms of the debt that is coming due. So this is debt maturity, debt that has to be repaid in 2021 through to 2042. And you can see very significant amounts of both domestic, that's the orange, and the foreign capital repayments that have to take place, and a substantial proportion of that guaranteed, that's red line, by the state. So technically, although it doesn't sit on the state's balance sheet, the rating agencies add it back in, it is indeed a contingent liability. And if you look at the next, over the next 3 years, so that first box, debt repayments of 183 billion rand, of which over 102 billion is payable by Eskom. We know well about the poor governance that has bedeviled many of the key SOEs, including Transnet, Denel, SAA, as well as Eskom. I, for my sins, sat on the board of SAA until we placed it in business rescue. The president has now appointed a presidential SOE council to review all SOEs, to look at the operational efficiencies and financial stability of those companies, with a particular focus, obviously, on Eskom. But we've seen increasingly an acknowledgement that the private sector has got a real and meaningful role to play alongside the state in those SOEs. And that in terms of interventions, those that are not fit for purpose and are not core to the state need to be migrated off the state balance sheet. That more broadly, key vacancies need to be filled within government, and operational efficiencies and wasteful expenditure curtailed and indeed stopped. No presentation would be complete without dealing with the issue of corruption and criminality. It is one of the most significant issues on the agenda of any board, of any company or institution, either in South Africa or outside South Africa. The public perception is unfortunately very negative. It's been exacerbated by the most recent PFMA overall audit outcomes, the number of outstanding audits, disclaimed audits, adverse audits, let alone qualified audits with findings or without findings. It's a sorry tale, I'm afraid, and we need to deal with it. And particularly, it manifests obviously in the context of unauthorized, irregular, and wasteful expenditure. And we hope that inter alia, the Zondo Commission, the SIU and other organs of the state will be able to prosecute appropriately. And I believe that each of us are shocked pretty much every day by the findings that emerge, and there need to be actions that are taken against officials for corruption and mismanagement. But I have to say that corruption and criminality is not simply a public sector manifestation, it's equally a private sector manifestation, and so too action needs to be taken against anybody in the private sector who breaks the law through corruption and criminality. And we need to deal with the illicit economy. We need to do so collectively, as we've said here, all of our social partners, business, civil society, organized labor, as well as the government itself, and take action which is clear, decisive, and sets a precedent going forwards. It's one of the reasons why there is so much attention now being focused on the Constitutional Court judgment being handed down as we speak, in fact, on former President Zuma. And then the transparency of procurement, the need to resource up the law enforcement agencies and indeed the judicial system and promote full tax compliance. In conclusion, I hope I haven't run over time. This is my final slide, and then very happy to take input, questions, and comments. What has become quite apparent over the past 15 months is that the only way that we can really move the needle is if we act in collaboration with one another as stakeholders. And by that, I mean government as the overall architect of economic strategy, business, labor, and community or civil society. It is the only way we'll be able to leverage all of the resources, both financial and human, that are at our disposal. We've been able to demonstrate, certainly in the last year, our ability to work collectively. We're doing so currently, and it may be if people have got a question, we've been able to do so currently in the context of the vaccination rollout program, where I'm leading the Business for South Africa effort in support of government. So that's spanning all of business to ensure that we can procure, administer the vaccine to as many people as quickly as possible and as efficiently as possible, despite all of the challenges. I'm clear in my own mind that if we didn't have this partnership, we would be far behind where we are currently, even if that's a matter of frustration for many people. And I think it's a very good model going forwards as to how we can collaborate between the public and the private sector. The Economic Reconstruction and Recovery Plan is aimed, as we say here, at restoring investor confidence, because that is a precursor to stimulating economic growth on a sustainable basis in terms of the ease of doing business, the structural reforms that are required, and critically importantly, the reprioritization of public spending, particularly in a constrained fiscal environment, relying primarily but not exclusively on private sector investment-led growth. So on this right-hand side of the slide, we identify the roles of the different key partners, government, as I've said, unlocking resources, but also overseeing the broader economic strategy for the country, labor and community mobilizing their constituencies, ensuring that they can drive local procurement, create a much more attractive environment for the recruitment and employment of staff, and business driving localization, ensuring that we do build a culture of compliance, preserve jobs and mobilize skills, and equally ensuring that we can mobilize and leverage both capital and human resources, financial capital, I mean, and put it at the disposal of the country at large. So in summary, I believe that we've come a long way in very difficult circumstances. This has all been constructed during the pandemic. We've all had to learn to live our lives in a very different way, more efficiently, at a distance, but also more collaboratively. And the work that I've shared with you today has been the work of, as I said, businesses outside of a formal structure, seeing how they could work together. There were some 450 people who worked together on a pro bono basis. They left their identities, their egos, their brands outside the door. It was all done in the interest of business for South Africa, and indeed, not just business for South Africa, but the national interest. Let us hope that we can start to implement some of the outputs as a matter of urgency so that we can place the country on a significantly accelerated path to inclusive and sustainable growth. And with that, Randall, Dr. Jonas, I will take down my slides, if I may, and open up for comments and questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mr. Kingston, for that wonderful and insightful presentation. A lot of information, but there are certain things that stood out for all of us that have been listening to you this morning. And I think there's a number of things that I would like to highlight in this and also get your opinion on some of the challenges we still face in our country. But I'm going to first open the floor for questions, and there's nothing yet in the chat boxes, so I'm going to open the plenary for questions. You may then raise your hand, or you may just unmute your mic, and then we can take question by question to Mr. Kingston. Okay. We are, of course, also reminding you, you can type your questions in the chat box. Martin, while we're waiting for people to gather their thoughts about this, an interesting aspect of your presentation right at the beginning was the policy stimulus statement that you've made. Do you think that the South African policy landscape is swift and efficient enough to provide the necessary policy guidelines for private sector and businesses to actually, bring about the kind of changes and the impact that we want to see in terms of employment and job creation and so on?
Okay, so that's a very good question. And my own experience has been over the past 27 years since 1994, is that we are good at formulating policy. Sometimes it's too over debated. There is a tendency for us to try and find consensus, and that takes a long time and often, of course, defaults to the lowest common denominator, which is not necessarily the right outcome. We would rather that there was decisive action that is taken having determined policy. And that secondly, certainly the private sector requires clear and predictable policy. Even if it's policy they find unattractive, they'd rather that it was clear and predictable than that it's opaque. So the first thing is that we need to have a much better route map of what the policy orientation of the country is and how it's emerging and being implemented. The second is that in many cases, there is a misalignment of policy between different departments or sectors. I'll give a very good example. It's actually a bad example, but it's a good example, is with respect to Black economic empowerment. We have been, I would have to say, experimenting with what is a model that works. But for different sectors, you'll find different interpretations. The BEE Commission and the Minister of Trade and Industry have been at loggerheads with one another about some of the interpretations. Now, if I look at the importance of transformation and Black economic empowerment in the economic landscape, then to have the sort of confusion that we've had over the past 10 or 15 years is highly problematic, I would argue. That's not an argument against transformation, far from it. It's to say, let's make sure that we have something that is clear, understandable, relatively simple, if that's possible, implementable, but consistent. I think that that applies more broadly to policy across the country. So my sense is we must be much more focused on a limited number of key interventions and key policies that can guide economic activity in the country. And then we need to hold the course, at least for a period of time. But if we recognize that we need to adjust, we need to do so openly, transparently, and responsibly.
Yes, thank you. You know, I was just as an example of what I would call some of the challenges in the policy landscape. I recall last year, I think it was around July, mid-year, around this time when you actually convened a meeting with us at the National Body of Business Schools, and you shared
Yes.
the Business for South Africa's Economic Recovery Strategy, the ERS. And I remember distinctly that that was probably the first strategy for economic recovery and turnaround that was on the table at the time, you know. And if I look at what happened down the line, it only got into October when government actually finally released the ERP, which actually took about 3 months. I understand the need for government to be involved in it. As you said, government is the architect of the economic reconstruction program in the country, but certainly we need some efficiencies as far as that is concerned. I've got one question that I don't want to miss in the chat box. I want to bring to you now. It comes from Tandutolo. He's Tandutolo Ngubalanga. My view is that localization should go together with SMME and employment stimulus because we need to encourage industry with government to drive willingness of corporates to support SMMEs using the CSIs, SDs, and EDs. Eventually, we want to see SMMEs championing localization. I think that is just a statement made. It also underpins the point that you have made, the role of SMMEs in terms of reskilling, for example, retrenchees, and playing an important role in the economic growth. South Africa has a huge SMME sector, lots of people wanting to be part of the economy, but they cannot because of constraints, access to markets, access to capital, and so on. And of course, we cannot get that kind of critical mass and the contribution that they should make to our economic growth. So with that comment, maybe you want to maybe just reflect on the comment by Tandutolo, Martin?
Yes, I think it's actually a very good comment, and I would support and agree with that view that has been expressed. I've read it in the chat box as well as what you have read out and commented on. I would make perhaps a couple of observations, and it's been a bone of let's call it contention between ourselves and government. That is that localization must be, by definition, ultimately commercially viable. We cannot persuade the private sector to invest in opportunities where they don't see that they can get a return on their capital, which is equivalent to other opportunities that are available for them to invest surplus capital or necessary capital. We can have a debate about social returns, but that is really a national issue. That is not for the private sector. I mean, obviously the private sector needs to act responsibly and appropriately. I say that because if we can't see industries, sectors, or indeed individual opportunities which offer an appropriate return, we are not going to persuade providers of capital, whether it be companies or institutions. So when I by institutions, I include banks, other forms of financial institutions, pension funds, and the like. They should not part with their money. In fact, if we look at pension funds, for those of us who are pensioners or are going to be pensioners, and everybody on this call is going to be a pensioner, I would imagine, sooner or later, they need to make sure that their savings are properly preserved, are responsibly invested, and can support them in their retirement. That is the purpose, after all, of retirement savings. So it needs to go into viable opportunities. And we need to be disciplined about which opportunities we support and which opportunities we reject. When I say we as a country, as well as we as the business community. Within that overall definition, and I've deliberately characterized it as such, Dr. Jonas, I think that our focus absolutely must be on localization, and it must be on small and medium-sized enterprises. As I said during my presentation, in most economies, the key driver of economic activity and GDP are not big multinationals. They may catch the headlines. It's small and medium-sized enterprises. They pay the majority of the taxes. They employ the majority of the people. They are the key intermediaries in the supply chain of goods and services. And we have done our SMMEs in South Africa a disbenefit by not creating an appropriate environment. Now, there are two sides to that coin as well. One is that the government needs to ensure that the regulation is fit for purpose for SMMEs. They don't have the resources to be able to navigate the multifaceted regulations, if I can put it that way, that exist. But the private sector also critically needs to play a role, as indeed I think has been identified both by Thando Xolo as well as by Deshni, which is, for the most part, the funding is going to come from the private sector. It's going to come from the banks, from institutions, and they need to amend their lending and investment policies appropriately so that they are prepared to take new and emerging entrepreneurs onto their books, but again with a caveat. The caveat is they need to be responsible. They need to live within the rules and regulations that apply, the risk appetite that is appropriate for those institutions. You know, those of us, if there are some, who put our money on deposit in the bank do so because we think that when they lend out those funds to a third party, they do so on the basis that they're going to get the money back so that we can get our deposits back. It's the same principle as retirement funding. We have ongoing debates in NEDLAC with people who suggest that banks should step up to the plate and they should simply lend recklessly. It's not going to happen. It is not, first of all, you know, it's a breach of their fiduciary responsibilities, as I am sure those on this call will know. But secondly, it's not sound common sense. They must lend responsibly. Can they help the underlying businesses borrow responsibly? Yes, of course they can. It's that's where I believe we must invest our time and effort. And so it's not just big business, but it's actually medium-sized businesses as well that can support these initiatives. And the sort of Tiger Brands venture capital initiative that was talked about here, there are many more opportunities such as that. They should be scaled, they should be replicated or duplicated wherever possible, to the extent that it is possible to be able to ensure that we can boost the level of SMMEs. And so when we look at the question about what role will the informal sector play in the economy and entrepreneurship, you will remember, Dr. Jonas, that we actually had a panel of entrepreneurs, including business schools, who were working with B4SA last year in the formulation of the Accelerated Economic Reconstruction plan, because we believed that it was harnessing that energy, that enthusiasm, those capabilities that would actually make a defining difference to the economic landscape in South Africa. Entrepreneurs thrive in even the most difficult of environments. But having said that, despite doing so, we need to facilitate the opportunity for them to do so on a sustainable basis and at scale.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you so much. There's one more question. I think there's two more. From Deshde, thanks to Mr. Kingston, looking on the enablers of infrastructure within ERRP, particularly the resource mobilization, with all that has been raised to formulate the financing or funding, a clear financing model is invisible. It seems infrastructure is not clearly understood as an asset class that can finance itself through its own cash flows. And then, of course, lastly, private sector-led growth, to me, it seems to be similar with finance-led government development as opposed to development-led financialization. Can industrialization be attainable under such an approach? Very complicated question, but I'm sure, Martin, you can tackle this one.
Okay. So let me try and break down. That is a very complicated question. Let me try and break it down. I see while we've been speaking that the former president has indeed been found guilty.
Oh my goodness.
And sentenced, apparently.
Oh my goodness.
We will see how the markets react to that, let alone how the environment reacts to that. So infrastructure-led growth is absolutely crucial, and we, I think, have all acknowledged that. There is a investment and infrastructure office that's been established within the presidency, led by Sputla Ramakgopa. He's doing an outstanding job. As the private sector, we've seconded experts, mainly people who've retired, into that structure under an initiative called TAMDEV to assist with that. And they do provide, it's an excellent asset class if it's done on a reliable and properly interrogated basis, where they can provide, if you like, an annuity yield over an extended period of time, which is generally speaking predictable and reliable by way of a return. I think that when I say private sector led growth, it doesn't just need to be private sector led. I think that there are many areas where it needs to be in collaboration with government. I've been very clear in every statement I've made publicly about the vaccination rollout program that the private sector is not doing the rollout independently of government. We're doing it under the auspices of a government overseen process. They are responsible for the design, development, and implementation of the vaccination rollout strategy. I would have to say the same applies to infrastructure. The infrastructure needs to be the remit of government, but do I think that the private sector can mobilize finance? Do I think it can mobilize the necessary skills and capabilities that it can operate those assets in an appropriate regulatory environment? Yes, I do think it can. And I think the same applies, by the way, in the context of industrialization. It needs to be viable and sustainable. I have major reservations about certain sectors of the economy that we try to industrialize without recognizing whether or not it is self-sustaining, it can attract the requisite capital, it can compete both domestically and internationally on all fours. It needs to be able to do so. But within those caveats, yes, I think it's absolutely possible and achievable.
Thank you, Martin. There's a number of questions coming out, and I'm going to try to distill some of them.
Yes.
In terms of SMMEs, the administrative management is not key to their skill sets. Should there be some intervention for them?
Yeah, there should. So the answer to that is absolutely. I think, by the way, that it's not that skill set is not just absent with many SMMEs. It's absent with larger companies. People would be shocked by how deficient many companies are in having the necessary administrative and management skills. And by the way, those administrative skills are needed for a requirement. If people were to observe these things properly and to have suitable systems that were transparent and accountable, we wouldn't have half of the corruption charges that we have in the private sector, let alone more broadly in the public sector. And we believe that there are many companies, many individuals who are prepared to lend their expertise to SMMEs, but also to other companies and the public sector more broadly. And we have impressed upon the government, including the president, our willingness to make such expertise available to the extent that it is both required and accepted.
Martin, there's another question there on the Africa Free Trade Agreements.
Yes.
Its impact on South African economic landscape.
Yeah, so I mean, it is a very significant development, the African Free Trade Agreement. We need to make sure that, again, it's implementable. There's no doubt that it opens up significant opportunity for intra-Africa investment and trade, and particularly for South Africa to play a much more significant role. If you look historically, the continent has been increasingly dependent upon not only the mobilization of capital from outside of the continent, but also from trade flows outside the continent, when in fact we have the capability to be much more effectively self-standing than we have been. So yes, I think it'll take time to really demonstrate traction, but we're all confident that it was the right thing, particularly, but not only around, for example, agro-industry and manufactured goods, where there is significant scope on the African continent. I know we're about to run out of time.
Yeah, Martin, there's one more question or two more questions basically dealing with localization.
Yes.
I think the question there is in terms of exclusion of goods and services which carry a different brand. The challenge is that there's no requirement which measures the implementation of the plan. I think that's perhaps just a comment.
Yeah, well, by the way, we are going to measure it. So that's one of our commitments as okay. Social partners, is we will measure it and we'll report publicly.
I see that the automotive sector has got a very strong emphasis on localization as well.
Correct, exactly so.
Okay. Then shareholder compact and governance be the priority in the process of reforming SOEs as opposed to radical privatization?
So I think radical privatization is politically unsavory, even if it's just the semantics rather than the substance. We can, in the context of the forms of cooperation and collaboration that we've talked about, in my opinion, achieve very much the same thing. We don't necessarily need to shift ownership of the assets concerned to ensure that they are more responsibly and more effectively operated or developed and operated, and that there is a much higher level of transparency and accountability to all stakeholders, including critically the public at large. So yes, I'm confident that it can.
Thank you so much, Martin. There's one more question, but I think we're going to leave that one for now. We just know that localization is going to be the new globalization, as they say globally.
Exactly so.
Yeah, Martin, so we want to really thank you for your wonderful contribution this morning to our guests and also our panel. Thank you very much for the insights that you've shared with us and your energy and your excitement about the prospects for our country. Your analysis of what the opportunities are is really, really heartwarming, and I think we are in for a good thing if we really follow through with the actions that this government has set itself for. We know that government is really steering the ERPP, but certainly there's nothing that stops private sector to also come up with initiatives, as long as the policy framework is supportive, and of course government is a willing partner in this. I think the elephant in the room remains corruption, as you said, and greed. And those things, if you look at the millions and billions that has been lost, the Zondo Commission exposures and so on, it's rather sad, but certainly something that must never be repeated again. And so it's all about governance and good governance, in fact, that ultimately will bring us the prosperity and create value for all people in this country. Without much further ado, Martin, thank you so much once again for being part of this panel, and the Business School of Nelson Mandela University. Appreciate your contribution and have a wonderful day further. Thank you so much.
Thank you. You too.
And thank you to our participants as well. Cheerio.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Goodbye.